In the spirit of Halloween, paranormal or not, what is the scariest, creepiest, or most unsettling experience of your life? When I was in middle school, I fell asleep on the couch in our living room. Around 1 a.m, I woke up and saw a man walk straight through the wall that separated our living room from my brother's bedroom. The man turned and looked at me, and half of his face was missing, as if he'd been dragged along a highway. He raised a finger to his lips, silently telling me not to say anything, then turned forward and walked right through our glass door and out into the yard. Terrified, I ran into my brother's room and found his bed empty. I started screaming and crying for my parents. They panicked too and began calling all of my brother's friends, trying to track him down. Eventually, they reached him and learned he'd been at a college party about an hour away, drinking. My dad drove out to pick him and his best friend up, not wanting them to risk driving home drunk. The next day, we found out that the kid who was originally supposed to drive my brother home had been killed, thrown from his car during a drunk driving accident. Story 2. I preface this by saying that I am not religious, and I do not believe in the paranormal. That said, it was the month of November, and I was visiting Edinburgh, Scotland. The air was bitterly cold, and I was bundled up in a long-sleeved shirt, a sweatshirt, and a winter jacket. That evening, my friends and I decided to join one of the city's haunted walking tours, the kind that takes you deep into the vaults beneath the streets. Those vaults are, of course, said to be haunted by the poor, the destitute, and the desperate souls who met gruesome ends down there. One underground chamber, in particular, is rumored to contain a demonic spirit, supposedly trapped within a circle of stone built by Wiccans to protect the living from its unrestrained evil. While standing beside the stone circle, my friend, who happens to be Wiccan, began chanting softly under her breath, the words barely intelligible. Suddenly, I felt a rush of cold air against the back of my neck. Then came the unmistakable sensation of nails raking down my back, deep, sharp, and deliberate, dragging from my shoulders all the way to my waist. I was completely frozen in place, too shocked to scream, every nerve in my body consumed by white-hot pain and terror. I spent the rest of the tour absolutely petrified, and when we finally emerged from the tunnels, I ran straight to the bathroom of a nearby pub. There, I pulled off all my layers, each one perfectly intact, only to find bright red marks slashed across the bare skin of my back. I've told this story to friends and family, and they all insist it should be enough to make me believe in the supernatural. I still don't, but I also can't explain what happened in those tunnels beneath Edinburgh. Story 3. I was sitting in our office room, home alone, when I was 19, typing a paper for one of my college classes. The office had previously been my sister's room before she moved out. So many of her decorations were still there. She had a photo of a mountain range, an oval-shaped mirror, and 3 different hangings that read faith, hope, and love. That made a total of 5 items hanging on the wall. Suddenly, I got random chills. It wasn't unusual, it was pretty cold, but this time, the moment the chills hit, everything hanging on the walls in that room fell off at once. It really freaked me out, but things got a little worse. I got up and walked out of the room, only to realize that everything hanging on a wall in the entire house had fallen, except for the television in my room, all the pictures in the living room and bedrooms, every trophy from my Little League days, even the stand that held candles. Everything was on the floor. I wasn't sure what to do. I picked up all the fallen items and rehung them, which actually took me around 15 to 20 minutes. Then I drove to campus to finish my paper, never telling my parents. It's also worth mentioning that this happened around noon on a sunny day 3 winters ago. Story 4. We lived in an insanely haunted house. I genuinely wouldn't believe in paranormal stuff if it weren't for living there. I had a 130-pound Akita, alpha male of his litter, and his grandfather had been the largest Akita ever shown in the States. This dog was massive and afraid of absolutely nothing. Even my dad, 6'7" and 250 pounds, couldn't really stop him from doing whatever he wanted. I was around 11 or 12 when we finally left that place. We'd moved there when I was in 2nd grade. The house itself was basically one long hallway, sitting on 5 acres of land on an island off the Pacific Northwest coast. Half of the property was covered in dense woods, deep green, thick with underbrush, and full of stinging nettles that grew more than an inch thick and several feet tall. Anyway, shortly after we moved in, my mom would sometimes come into my room in the early hours of the morning. She'd ask if I had been up, running down the hallway. Of course, I never had. I was asleep. Then I started hearing the same thing. It sounded like several grown people running at full speed down the hallway, which was about 100 yards long. We had a huge basement that covered about 3/4 of the house. My dad, who used to be a producer out in Los Angeles, had set up his home theater and music equipment down there. There were plenty of video games, so I spent a lot of time in that space. My parents weren't your average Americans. My mom had 2 master's degrees, and my dad had 1. They were both very intelligent and extremely skeptical. My dad never let any strange occurrence go unexplained, always insisting there had to be a rational reason, like wind creating odd sounds at night. I spent a lot of time in the basement playing video games and watching movies. When my cousins came over, they lived nearby, which was part of why we moved there. We'd also spend time outside, cutting down stinging nettles with sticks. Anyway, I'll start with the basement. I've blocked out a lot of what happened, so bear with me. I think the first time I noticed something was off down there. It was just this really messed up feeling. You know that sense you get as a kid when you walk into a place and instantly know it's not safe? Yeah, I've never felt that more strongly than in that basement or in that house for that matter. My giant, fierce alpha male of a dog refused to go down the basement stairs ever. He literally couldn't be dragged down, not even by my stepdad. We tried to make the basement his room, but he wouldn't budge. So that was strike 1. As time went on, we lived there for a few years. We started noticing strange things. One night, every piece of electronic equipment in the basement turned on at the same time, around 4 in the morning. The volume cranked all the way up on everything, even though it had never been set higher than halfway. It was a massive audio system, and the sound was deafening. That's when I think my parents started to have real doubts about the house. They called Brinks, our alarm company, but none of the doors had been triggered. Everything was locked. Brinks sent out a technician to check, but there were no signs of forced entry. It actually happened several more times after that, but that was the beginning. Our basement also had a small wooden storage closet in the very back. Every so often, we'd need to get something out of it. I remember one time, my dad asked me to grab something, and I flat out refused. There was no way I was going back there alone. Now I was the kind of kid who did whatever I wanted, whenever I wanted, by myself and without a second thought. I spent hours roaming our property with BB guns, bows, sticks, and ninja stars. I wasn't afraid of much, but that room scared me more than anything on earth ever has. It had concrete walls that had cracked over the past century, and handmade wooden shelves and panels attached to the house. Sure, it looked creepy, but I'd been in plenty of creepier places. This one just had a feeling, a heavy, unmistakable vibe that said, don't mess with this room. Years later, I asked my parents about it, and they said, oh yeah, that was a really creepy room. We never liked going in there either. Anyway, a couple of years into living there, my parents were in that room one night, when every box above shoulder height suddenly flew off the shelves. Every single one. The shelves themselves didn't move, and there was nothing that could have caused them to fall. The boxes just launched off the shelves and hit my parents hard, as if someone had thrown them. Not long before that, my dad had rented a tractor. He'd been digging up the septic tank. There were no maps of the house or property. It was a pretty old place that had only a couple of owners before us, and the previous owner had died shortly after we moved in. We had no way to locate anything underground, other than guessing where a septic tank might be. So my dad was out there with his tractor, digging up what looked like a septic mound, when he came running back inside. It turned out that it wasn't a septic tank at all. It was a massive pile of native artifacts, including a few bones that were later confirmed to be human. My mom, being very intelligent, started researching the local tribes. There hadn't been any on the island for 50 years, but she managed to track down the tribes that had lived there and got in touch with them. They scheduled a visit for the next day, flying in from Alaska. We were expecting 1 or 2 people, but they brought all the Inuit elders they could gather. Literally 10 older men showed up. The head elder took one look at the now dug mound, then toured the property, finding several more. He even went through the house and immediately told us we had to move and that the house could only be sold to a business, not a private owner. He said people were never meant to live there, that our house sat on a burial ground. My parents, being a little too smart for their own good, decided they weren't going to move right away. So the elder cleansed the house with their traditional prayers, sage, and other rituals. We ended up moving a year or 2 later, and that house is now a muscle cannery. Still, it was hands down the creepiest place I've ever been, and I've been to plenty of supposedly haunted houses and a few sites where massacres took place. Nothing has ever made me feel the way that place did. There were a lot more strange things that happened there. Shadowy figures shaped like people, odd floating lights, and other weird stuff. I'll ask my mom to help refresh my memory if you all want to hear more. Story 5. I'm not sure this is the worst thing I've experienced, but it's the one that comes to mind right now, mostly because it's happening as we speak. I'm currently living alone in a small house in a tiny village out in the countryside. The house has been in my family for over 200 years, but before I moved in, nobody had lived here for about 20. There are 2 floors, but the upper floor only has 2 rooms, both in pretty rough shape. Sometime in the past 75 to 100 years, no one alive seems to know exactly when the hatch that led upstairs was sealed off. At this point, the only way to get up there is through the single window on that floor. There's a ladder permanently fixed outside that leads to it, and the window has a wooden shutter that can only be opened from the outside. The house doesn't actually belong to me. It's my mother's. She lives about 3 or 4 hours away and comes by for a few days each month. Most of the restoration work has been her project, since I'm physically disabled and can only do so much myself. Here's where the issue starts. For a while now, I've been hearing scratching and small thumps coming from the top floor. I assumed it was just a small animal or something that had gotten in, since the noises weren't very loud and the shutter up there was broken and always left open. At the beginning of the month, when my mother came to visit, I asked if she could climb the ladder and fix the shutter so we could seal off the upper floor. She did. It was an easy fix, and she made sure to close everything up before leaving. A couple of days ago, I was coming back from the store when I noticed that the shutter upstairs was open. I figured it was just the wind, but since I'm not great with ladders, I didn't climb up to close it. For the past few nights, I've been hearing those same small bumps and scratches again, so I assumed some animal had gotten back in. No big deal, it happens. Then last night, around 3 in the morning, I was gaming on my PC and watching a show on my second screen at the same time. Headphones on, volume up. Out of nowhere, over the noise of everything, I hear a massive bang from upstairs, like something heavy just toppled over. So naturally, at 3 a.m., alone in this ancient house, I'm convinced there's a serial killer or something equally horrifying living on my second floor. I'm definitely not climbing up there to check. I've simply accepted my new upstairs roommate and can only hope he's not planning to kill me in my sleep. Oh, and if I suddenly stop posting on Reddit in the next few days, just assume I didn't make it. Please, someone do me one last favor. Delete my browser history. Story 6. At my dad's last house, I stepped out onto the back porch to get some fresh air. My dad and his now ex-wife were getting ready to set up a garden. He also wanted to plant a tree in the backyard, so after a while, he started digging a hole for it. As he was digging, his shovel hit something hard, like a big rock. He began working on digging it out, and after a while, he realized it was a fairly large rock. I don't remember the exact size, but it was big enough to pique his curiosity. About an hour later, the rock was finally dug up. The day after the rock was dug up, I started having trouble sleeping. Every night, I'd get this unnerving feeling that someone else was inside the house, someone other than my dad and his then wife. There's one night in particular that I'll never forget. My bedroom door was always left open, and that night, there was a candle burning on a shelf just outside my room. At some point during the night, I could have sworn I saw a shadow flicker into view near the candle, then vanish just as quickly. At first, I brushed it off, telling myself it was only my imagination playing tricks on me. A few weeks later, my dad told everyone that we were moving to a new house in a different area. We left the old place and settled into our new home, where we've lived ever since. One day, out of the blue, my dad asked if he had ever told me what was really going on in that house. I said no, he had never mentioned it until then. He told me that the rock he had dug up was actually a tombstone. It had foreign writing on it that looked like Arabic. After digging it up, he began noticing strange things. Shelves slowly opening and closing on their own, and footsteps echoing from the hallway. I asked why I had never heard the footsteps. He explained that they usually happened very early in the morning, around 1 to 3 o'clock, when everyone else was asleep. Dad was afraid things would get worse over time, so he decided it was best for us to move. Later, we found out that the people who owned the house before us had a relative who had passed away there and was quite possibly buried in the backyard. Story 7. When I was around 16, my ever-growing family finally moved out of the house I'd lived in my entire life. As we packed up, we kept reminiscing, swapping stories, and laughing about all the little moments that had happened within those walls. At one point, I got a bit nostalgic and decided to sneak into the downstairs closet with a flashlight and read a small ritual I used to love as a kid whenever I wanted peace and quiet. Now this was one of those deep closets that extended under the stairs, about 8 feet back, before turning left into a low 3-foot-high space. That little nook had always been packed with old blankets and stuffed animals, forming a soft, cozy pile. Naturally, that was the perfect spot to curl up with a flashlight and read, quiet, hidden, and surrounded by a comforting mountain of fluff. About an hour in, I shifted to get more comfortable, and that's when I heard it. A low, slow, warped, hoarse voice said, "You always make me happy." I completely lost it, slammed my head on the low ceiling, scrambled to my feet, and practically tore the door off its hinges getting out. My family stared at me as I tried to explain, still pale and gasping for air. Once I finally calmed down, I went back to investigate. Turns out, it was my old stuffed little bear, the one I'd had since I was 3 or 4. I must have leaned on him just right to press his belly and trigger the old voice box. But when I tried pressing it again, there was nothing. Silence. That poor little bear, untouched for over a decade, had used the last of its power, its dying breath, to tell me I'd made it happy. You made me happy too, little bear. When you're not making me piss myself. Story 8. This would probably be scary to some people, but I found it hilarious. For about a month during my 3rd year of college, I started seeing people who weren't actually there. I never got it checked out, but I suspect I might have been having mini seizures. Among those strange incidents was this one odd week when I decided not to wear pants while sleeping. I had always worn pajama pants or shorts, but a female friend mentioned how great it feels to sleep in just panties, so I figured I'd give it a try. I'm Chinese, and my parents are very proper. They would never approve of me not wearing pants around the house, but I thought it would be fine as long as I locked my door before going to sleep so they couldn't walk in. Every night that week, I'd wake up in the middle of the night to see a guy sitting on the couch in my room, facing me and just watching. The weirdest part? This guy was blonde, probably in his late teens, and Caucasian, wearing a white t-shirt and jeans. He was above average handsome, maybe a 7 out of 10, but nothing to die for. I mean, I'm Chinese. My closest friends are all Asian, so why on earth would I be seeing some random white guy of all things? Anyway, my first reaction wasn't, "Oh my God, there's an intruder in my room." It was, "Oh my God, there's a guy in my room, and I'm not wearing any pants." I'd get up and walk over to where he was sitting, right on the couch where I usually kept my clean, folded laundry. The whole time, he'd just sit there, silently staring at me, while I grabbed a pair of pants, pulled them on, climbed back into bed, and went right back to sleep. This happened every single night during that week I experimented with sleeping without pants. Always the same guy, always the same spot on the couch, always the same reaction from me. The only thing that really bothered me was that he was a guy and he was seeing me without pants on. And yes, every morning I woke up wearing pants. When I told my mom about it, her reaction was exactly what you'd expect. She said, "Didn't I always tell you to sleep with pants on? What if there was a fire? You'd have to run outside with no pants on." I guess in her mind, the possibility that an actual person might have broken into my room in the middle of the night to watch me sleep was less concerning than the idea of me running outside half-dressed. Anyway, during that month, a lot of strange things like this happened. Different people, same story. They were never really there. And after that month ended, it never happened again. Story 9. I was 15 years old and had just gotten home from work. I went to my bedroom to change out of my work clothes and get ready for bed. In the middle of undressing, I glanced at my bedroom window and caught my reflection, or so I thought. But then I saw a man's face staring back at me. I dropped to the floor and turned off the lights, scrambling to get dressed while keeping my eyes on the window. The face was gone, but then I saw something even worse. A camera, pointed directly at me as I sat frozen on the floor. I bolted from my room and told my mom and brother. My brother ran outside, and we found our ladder from the backyard lying beneath my window, but no one was around. I couldn't sleep for a year after that. I just stared at that window every night. Haven't thought about it in years. Thanks, Reddit. Story 10. Army Housing Estate, Soest, Germany. 9. It was dark, late autumn. The air was warm enough that I barely noticed it. No wind, no traffic, no people around. Just me, 11, and my mate Steve, kicking about near our home in the early evening. Behind the blocks of flats where we lived was an open grassy area with a swing, a climbing frame, and a solitary large horse chestnut tree. A single street lamp lit the path to the next row of flats, about 100 meters away, forming the top side of a rectangle, with the 2 rows of flats and the path, was the main road through the estate. As we stepped from the brightly lit road into the darker area, we both stopped dead. Moving quickly down the road, from right to left, was a large shape. It was vaguely human in form, and judging by the buildings it passed in front of, easily 6 to 8 feet tall. Its outline rippled, like cloth moving underwater. And it was black. Not a dark color black, not in the shadows black. It was walking down the middle of a well-lit road after all. It was the kind of black that looked like a hole cut out of reality. A moving, living block of unlight. It cast no shadow that we could see, and the light that hit it revealed no texture, no detail at all. We stood there, speechless, staring. 1 second. 2 seconds. Steve whispered, "Do you see that?" I whispered back, "Yes." And then the friggin' thing changed direction. Toward us. As it came up over the curb, I knew it was real. This wasn't a trick of the light, or some weird reflection. It was something that followed at least a few of the laws of our world. It crossed the curb, and moved faster now, slipping straight into the same darkness where we stood. We broke and ran, back to Steve's flat. Instead of splitting up and heading for our own homes, I'd made the mistake of turning right, and now we were planted, terrified, in the stairwell of his block. He bolted, leaving me alone to my fate. Jerk. I don't know how long I waited before the fear of being late home finally outweighed the fear of what was out there in the dark. But eventually, I sprinted the 20 meters from Steve's block to mine, eyes fixed straight ahead, certain I was going to be taken at any second. I got a beating for being late, and Steve and I never spoke of it again. But sometimes, just sometimes, when I'm walking at night, the streets are quiet, and the air is warm, I wonder what I'd do if I saw it again. Would I challenge it, or would I run? I honestly have no idea. Story 11. Cop here. I've shared this story before, so it might sound familiar. I was dispatched to a house around 1 in the morning for a prowler call. When we arrived, we spoke with the residents. Long story short, they said they had seen 2 people wearing masks. One was a Jason-style hockey mask, and I don't remember the other, in the yard across the street. It was about 2 weeks after Halloween, so it didn't sound too far-fetched. We checked the area, but didn't find anything. 10-8. It's worth noting that the residents didn't seem drunk, high, or unstable at all. Every now and then, you'll get a similar call, and arrive to find the residents strung out on meth, and seeing things. But back to the story. About an hour later, we got called back. This time, our dispatcher stayed on the phone with the residents while we surrounded the area. There were about 5 of us, positioned perfectly. Dispatch told us the residents could still see the prowlers in the next yard. We started to move in. Then dispatch said the residents saw the 2 prowlers wave and walk into the shed. Guess where I was? That's right next to the shed. I gave verbal commands, banged on the door, and got nothing. Fine, I thought. Screw it. I'll go in after you. I opened the door, and nothing. The shed was completely empty. I even checked for a trapdoor. Nothing. The structure was raised about 4 inches off the ground, so there was no chance of a hidden exit underneath either. We searched the entire area again, and found absolutely nothing. I went back to talk with the residents. They said that as I was moving in on the shed, both figures had put a finger to their lips, making the gesture, and then waved. They walked into the shed, just as I reached it. We went over every possible explanation. If the caller had been messing with us, there was no prior history of false reports from that address. I'm not much of a believer in the paranormal, but I can still appreciate a situation where I can't logically explain what just happened. Story 12. This one is not too scary, but my aunt and uncle moved into a 19th century home in a small town in Maine a few years ago, something straight out of a Stephen King novel. Their neighbors warned them about previous paranormal incidents, and since moving in, many more have occurred. These incidents include, but aren't limited to, an overwhelming chocolate smell filling the kitchen when no one has been cooking. Random items would appear in places they shouldn't be. My aunt, a retired school administrator, kept a filing cabinet full of old documents in the basement. One night, while I was visiting, I woke up to find a binder from that cabinet lying underneath my bed. The filing cabinet was in the very back of their storage space, and would have required someone to climb over camping gear, old furniture, and other clutter to reach it. Weird. Levitating objects. Super skeptical of this one. One day, my aunt was home alone, running on the treadmill in the basement, when she heard unexplained banging noises coming from the ground floor. Frustrated, she yelled, "For heaven's sake, shut up already!" And the banging immediately stopped. The most memorable incident for me happened when my uncle's medication went missing. My aunt shouted to the ghost that his medication was important and absolutely not something to mess with. Later, they found his pill bottles standing upright beneath the bed, perfectly upright. They couldn't have rolled there. It never happened again. The ghost has never done anything harmful, and from what I've heard, can even be described as playful. We've affectionately dubbed the spirit Gracie the Ghost. Story 13. A few years ago, my family moved to New Hampshire. First off, let me explain that the basement had an exterior door you could open from the backyard, and that door was made of plywood, so if someone had really wanted to break in, they easily could have. One night, my 3 sisters, my brother and I, were all in the living room. The basement door was in that same room. My brother, trying to scare everyone, started saying he could hear noises coming from the basement. Finally, he got up and opened the door. That's when we saw it, a shadow, and the sound of someone sprinting full speed up the basement stairs toward us. We screamed bloody murder. My stepdad came running down, butcher knives in hand, ready to defend us. He went into the basement, and there was no one there. The exterior door was still intact. After that night, our dog refused to go into the living room, and it had already avoided the basement. I was 16 at the time, and a few weeks later, I moved in with other family members. Nope. Story 14. When I was 8 years old, I was sitting in the dining room, drawing at the kitchen table. Suddenly, I heard what sounded exactly like my mother's voice say hello to me. I turned to my left, expecting to see her, but instead, I saw a full-bodied shadow figure standing about 10 feet away from me, right there in the kitchen. I sat frozen, staring at it for what felt like 10 seconds. Then it turned to its left and walked straight into the wall. I stood up, heart pounding, and walked into the living room where my brother was doing his homework. "What's wrong?" he asked. "I saw a ghost." "Is that what called your name?" That moment still chills me because I never told him it had said my name. For some backstory, my grandmother had died about 6 to 8 months earlier from lung cancer. She had the same voice as my mother and had cared for me when I was a baby, though I never knew her well. In the final stages of her illness, I visited her with my family, and she looked terribly frail. My only memory of her is from when she was dying. What's always struck me as strange about that experience is the amount of energy it must take to manifest and speak, and with all that effort, the only message was a simple hello? It's just so odd. Story 15. When I was younger, I used to get sick a lot. Strep throat and ear infections often brought on very high fevers, and high fevers lend themselves to hallucinations. Mine were never benign. My mother was no stranger to me spinning wild fantasies while lost in these fevered states. Once I told her I had eaten glass, and I was so utterly convinced of it that she started to believe me too, growing panicked until my father managed to calm her down. But I digress. I was 11 or 12 years old, on vacation with my family in Hawaii. Naturally, because I was always the one to bring the party down, I came down with a terrible ear infection, complete with a dangerously high fever. The hallucinations hit around midnight, after I woke up, most likely from the pain in my ear. I was sleeping on a convertible couch in the front room of a small grass house, and through the sliding glass doors, I saw an elderly woman rocking in a chair on the porch. She was wrapped in a dark cloak, her features completely hidden, yet I knew instinctively that she was an old woman. Slowly she stopped rocking, turned to face me, and raised a skeletal hand to pull back the hood of her robe. As the moonlight fell across her face, the idea of an elderly woman dissolved into the stark white bone of a skull. Her eye sockets were empty, yet I could feel her gaze fixed on me, seeing me. I don't know how to properly describe a skull grinning, but she did in that moment. Then she stood, collected her scythe, and stalked off the porch. I looked out the living room window, the one just above where my bed was set up, and saw her standing a short distance away, watching a procession of people making their way down the beach. As they drew closer, I realized they were carrying a casket. A little boy trailed behind the group, his head hung low. When the procession stopped beneath my window, they set the casket down and opened the lid to reveal the same little boy inside. He was bearing witness at his own funeral. In that fever-ridden moment, I understood for the first time that I was going to die someday. Even now, 2 decades later, thinking about what I saw that night still leaves a hard knot of fear spinning in my stomach. That memory turns me right back into a terrified little girl. Story 16. One night, about 10 months ago, a heavy snowstorm hit my area. The roads were completely closed, and a curfew was put in place for everyone except emergency medical personnel. I'd spent most of the day outside shoveling snow, and by nightfall, I was exhausted. I barely had the energy to eat dinner before collapsing onto the couch. I put on some old-school Star Trek, the original series, and started to drift off. A couple of hours later, around 1 in the morning, I woke to the sound of a door rattling and a faint whisper calling my name, Vladimir Poinin. I sat up, groggy but alert, and realized the sound was coming from my parents' room. The whisper grew fainter over time, but it didn't stop. After about 10 minutes of sitting there frozen, my curiosity and fear finally collided, and I decided to find out what the hell was going on. With a cheap folding knife gripped tightly in my hand, I crept into the hallway. Nothing. The house was still, but the noise continued, coming from the next room. The rattling grew faster, more frantic as I approached. Heart pounding, I slowly turned the doorknob and stepped inside. The room was pitch black. I couldn't see a thing. My eyes were taking forever to adjust to the darkness. I shuffled forward slowly, heart hammering, every sound amplified by the silence of the house. Then suddenly, something grabbed my leg and tugged. I jumped back, completely terrified. The whispering started again, low and strained. Then I recognized the voice. It was my dad. He was calling for help. He'd had a stroke while walking to the bathroom around 1 in the morning. After he fell, he managed to use his left foot to knock against the bathroom door, trying to make enough noise for someone to hear. My mom had fallen asleep on the couch in the living room and didn't hear a thing. I grabbed the house phone and called 911. Despite the storm and the roads being closed, the police and an ambulance arrived within 10 minutes. That was the scariest night of my life. The doctors told us there wasn't much hope for my dad before he went into surgery. He'd suffered a hemorrhagic stroke, and the bleeding was massive. We were told to prepare for the worst. Fast forward 10 months, and he's still here. Cognitively, he's the same man he always was. Sharp, stubborn, and funny as ever, though he's paralyzed on his right side. During his hospital stay, he battled every infection imaginable, but somehow, he pulled through. He was my best friend before the stroke, and my hero after. Story 17. We rented a house that never felt like home. Every time you walked inside, it gave you the creeps, like someone was watching you. My boyfriend and our roommate both worked nights, so I was often there alone. One night, I was doing my usual routine, watching some TV before bed. All evening, I had this overwhelming feeling that I shouldn't look down the hallway. It was unsettling. The sensation of being watched, and the fear that came with it, lasted for about 2 hours before I finally decided to face it and head to my room. I left the hallway lights on and went to bed. Just as I turned off the bedside lamp, I heard the sound of a drawer sliding open and hitting the stopper. I switched the light back on, but nothing was out of place. This happened about 6 times before I gave up and decided to sleep with the light on. I curled up under the covers and waited for my boyfriend to get home. He came rolling in around 3 o'clock in the morning, laughing at me for being such a coward. He got into bed, turned off the light, and that's when all hell broke loose. Every door down the hallway slammed shut one after another, and then our closet doors began to rattle. The noise coming from inside sounded like total destruction, as if the shelves, the pole, and everything in there were being violently thrown around. My boyfriend dove under the covers with me, both of us frozen in terror. When it finally stopped, it took about 5 to 10 minutes to convince him to check the house. Nothing was out of place. Our roommate had driven 3 hours back home that night to visit his family, so we knew it couldn't have been him. We slept with the light on for the rest of the night and moved out soon after. Even now, I can't drive past that house without feeling creeped out. Story 18. This is a true story. I've told it several times, but I'm not sure how well it will translate to text, so bear with me. My ex-wife and I lived in a small, second-story apartment. Her then 3-year-old daughter also lived with us. Struggling to make ends meet while caring for our little family meant we often worked opposite shifts and had very little time together. I frequently pulled long shifts at work, sometimes leaving shortly after midnight and not getting home until afternoon. She would often tell me about the strange vibes she felt in the apartment whenever I wasn't around. Shadows she'd catch out of the corner of her eye. Voices and noises that always seemed just out of earshot. I brushed it all off, blaming headlights from passing cars or sounds drifting in from the neighbors. As time went on, she grew frustrated with how quickly I dismissed her worries. Still, the strange activity never escalated, and nothing unusual ever happened when I was home. At least, nothing I couldn't find a reasonable explanation for. The skeptic in me was certain it wasn't anything paranormal. One night, by some rare stroke of luck, we were both home, which was unusual enough on its own. Her daughter was asleep in her room. It's a little tricky to describe the layout of the apartment. We were on the couch in the living room, snacking on junk food and watching TV. Behind us was a short hallway, her daughter's room on one side, ours on the other, the bathroom in between, and the laundry room directly across from it. There wasn't much need for a nightlight in her room, since the street lamp in the parking lot cast plenty of glow through her window. During one of those dark moments, when the TV screen goes black before a commercial, we could clearly see the faint reflection of that light shining through her window, flickering softly on the TV. During one commercial break, we saw the light, then it was gone, then it was back again. We both saw something block it, and she knew it. This was the first time anything strange had happened while we were together, and she was ready to jump straight into, "I told you. I know you saw that." Meanwhile, I was just as ready to explain it away. Maybe the streetlight flickered. Maybe a big bird flew by. Nothing weird, I'd prove it. I hadn't even stood up from the couch before a toy in the kids' room started making noise. "I told you. This is what happens every night when you're at work. And you never believe me. It probably just fell. It's nothing, I promise. Why are you yelling?" Before I could finish the sentence, 3 toys started going off. One reciting the alphabet, another counting numbers, another mooing like a cow. "Did they all fall too?" she screamed. I walked into the room and found all the suspect toys scattered in different corners. They hadn't fallen, they were upright, spread out, blinking and chirping like nothing had happened. Okay, maybe they were faulty. Weak batteries make toys act weird, right? I could explain this. I would explain this. We moved to our bedroom to continue the argument. Yes, a full-blown argument about ghosts. Our ghosts. In our apartment. To this day, it's the most ridiculous fight I've ever had, and somehow it just kept escalating. After several minutes of shouting, and with no more paranormal activity, she'd had enough. She started packing a few essentials, declaring she was going to her mom's, which, naturally, made things worse. Do you realize how crazy you're going to sound banging on your mom's door at 2 in the morning because our apartment is haunted? Lesson learned. Never, under any circumstances, call a woman crazy. She started throwing a week's worth of clothes into her bag, then moved on to the toiletries. The argument followed her into the bathroom as she tossed shampoo, toothpaste, and whatever else she could grab into the pile. By then, I'd had enough of the whole ridiculous ordeal. "There's no such thing as ghosts," I shouted, slamming both hands down on the counter. The second my palms hit that laminate countertop, every light in the bathroom, hallway, laundry room, and bedroom went out. I stood there in the sudden dark, heart pounding, and said the only thing left to say, "Go to your mom's." She did, grabbed her stuff, her daughter, and walked out. I stayed in the apartment a couple more days by myself. Nothing else happened. She eventually came back without incident, and well, we eventually got divorced. I don't think it had anything to do with the ghosts, but who knows. After we'd been separated for almost 2 years, we ran into each other a few times and started talking again. Eventually, I asked if I could take her and her daughter out to lunch, just to catch up, be friendly. I drove out to their new place, which happened to be in the same town, and picked them up. On the way out, I took the old familiar road that passed our former apartment. It was one of the main streets out of town. From the back seat, her daughter piped up, "That's our old house." We both half smiled. "Yeah, a beat." Then she said, almost to herself, "I didn't like it there." "Why's that?" I asked, catching her eyes in the rearview mirror. She looked at me, matter of fact, the mean old man in my room. Story 19. Say what you will, here's what happened. When I was in college, I lived with roommates in a 5-bedroom house just outside the city. The house was built before any of the surrounding neighborhood existed, so it sat sideways on our street. The right side had a fancy porch and front door. It was a duplex, and that side was owned by a man who lived alone. He made a lot of money in his work and traveled frequently, rarely being home. Our side was clearly what had once been the back of the house. Obviously, the house had been split down the middle sometime after it was built, and you could tell a staircase had been squeezed into the back hallway. The basement door had been walled off, things like that. There were large gaps between the walls and the floor in some places, and in one of them, you could even see several scraps of paper with barely legible writing on them. It was a quirky house, but we were a quirky group, mostly art students attending the various art schools in the city. People were constantly graduating and moving back home, so the rooms changed hands quite often. The walls were covered with paintings and sculptures, created by both roommates and friends. One particular painting always seemed to catch people's attention. Even though it did not exactly stand out, it had been painted by one of the original roommates, based on a bust of an old woman she had seen somewhere. She had painted it as if it were a living person, giving it skin tone and texture. I had joked about the painting ever since I first saw it, how it had creeped me out from the very beginning. My bedroom was the only one on the first floor, and the painting sat at the top of the stairs. That meant I had to walk right past it to get to the bathroom. At first it bothered me, but not enough to do anything about it. Eventually, though, it became too much. Late at night, when the house was dark and quiet, I could barely stand to walk by it. I would go out of my way to use the back stairs to the bathroom, or, in very desperate moments, I would even go outside. Eventually, I went to my roommate in confidence, unsure how to bring it up. I told her that I loved her art, and that even this painting was technically impressive. It just affected me on some deep level, and I couldn't deal with it anymore. She was very understanding, and we decided to rotate the artwork in the house so that this painting ended up in the living room. Here's where I tend to lose people. I think this upset the painting. Almost immediately, strange things started happening. My roommates and I would talk about how uneasy we sometimes felt in the house, like there was some kind of presence there. It started off as joking, but as time went on, we all began to take it more seriously. Our first summer in the house came around, and some of us went back to our families and sublet our rooms. I stayed behind, as I had nowhere else to go at the time. One of the top floor rooms went to a girl we found on Craigslist. The roommate, M, who had contacted her, had admittedly never lived for an extended period with people she liked, so she often sublet her rooms this way. The subletter, K, was odd from the start. I met her one night when I came home from work. She was just hanging out in the living room with M, talking about whatever. M had an exasperated look on her face and asked if I would go to the store with her. K came along, tried to get some ice cream, but couldn't pay, so I covered it. We walked back to the house, and K decided to head home, got on her bike, and left. M breathed a huge sigh of relief, and then told me that K had only come by for a quick tour, but ended up staying for 8 hours. She just wouldn't take the hint to leave, and since she didn't technically live there, M hadn't wanted to leave her alone. So she was awkward, I thought, and brushed it off. Karam came back about a week later to give us a check, and ended up staying for 6 hours this time. Again, no one was really sure what to do. A few weeks after that, Kay moved in. She mostly kept to herself, but every interaction with her was completely insane. She carried around a blonde wig at all times. I never saw her wear it. She just always had it. She insisted on keeping a mini fridge in the bathroom for her cooking ingredients, claiming that the kitchen fridge overwhelmed her. She had a hammock strung up on the side of the house and often slept out there instead of inside. All of her possessions were in a trunk in the living room, and I eventually caught her trying to coax a mouse that had been living in it. She often came home with different guys who worked at the shops and restaurants nearby. One time, I came home to find her sprawled out asleep on the porch in front of the door, her wig clutched tightly in hand. When I got curious and looked in her fridge, I found a bag of dead cicadas, and of course she was obsessed with the painting. She talked about it constantly. So she was weird, overbearingly weird. It clicked a little for me when I found one of her pill bottles, now being used for spices. Being the nosy person I am, I Googled the medication. I can't remember the exact name, but it was some heavy-duty antipsychotic stuff. One day, Mem came back to visit. She told me she had been in Kay's room and found stapled to the ceiling a collection of used condoms. Later, Mem returned with all of her things to move back in, and Kay flipped out. They had allegedly agreed that the sublease was over that day, but Kay insisted it wasn't. After a long argument, Kay decided she would stay out in her hammock for the remainder of her time there. A few days later, I came home from work to find my roommates and several friends sitting around, wide-eyed. Apparently, while I was gone, Kay had come home with a much older man, locked herself in the bathroom with him, and had intimate time for a very long time. When she finally came out, she told everyone she had gotten her revenge for kicking her out. We soon discovered what that meant. She had taken all of her used condoms and emptied the contents all over the bathroom. Afterward, she broke down crying uncontrollably and left the house. We never saw her again. That doesn't mean she wasn't still around. Her belongings mysteriously disappeared one day, even though no one had seen her come back for them. More troubling, the keys to the basement went missing. We eventually worked up the courage to go down there and look around, but found no trace of her. It didn't matter though. So long as she had those keys, she could come and go whenever she wanted. Every so often, one of us would swear we heard voices coming from down there. Before Kay, the house had been a little creepy. After Kay, it became downright disturbing, and all of it seemed to center around that painting. One night, I was in the living room with a few friends, smoking joints and whatnot. No one else was home. I was telling them about Kay and how unsettling the house felt in general. As soon as I got to the part about the painting, almost on cue, it flew off the wall. It didn't fall. It flew and landed all the way across the room. We all stared at each other, stunned, then bolted out the door and down the street. We walked around for a while, trying to shake it off, but it was my house, and eventually I had to go back. Another time, again, when no one else was home, and again involving weed. A friend and I left a freshly packed bowl on the coffee table while we stepped outside for a few minutes. When we came back, the bowl had been completely smoked. On multiple occasions, I walked into the living room to find the painting upside down. I would get furious, convinced my roommates were messing with me. But after how angry I got and how seriously I confronted them, I could see in their faces that none of them were responsible. Our neighbors had a cat that liked to wander into our house like he owned the place, and we thought it was funny, so we let him. He was a good cat, so it never really bothered anyone. One night, I was walking through the living room with the lights off when I heard the cat make a noise. I hadn't known he was inside, and since we didn't keep food around, I figured I'd let him out. I turned on the light and looked toward the corner where I'd heard the sound. The goddamn painting was sitting there, leaning against the wall. That was the last friggin' straw, and I insisted my roommate take the painting back to her studio. All at once, everything stopped. No more unsettling feelings in the house. No more voices in the basement. Nothing. Here's what I learned from the whole thing. No one actually wants to live out a horror movie. At least in those, you eventually get an explanation for the haunting or whatever's going on. What's even more terrifying is being the roommate in the horror movie. I never got any explanation. What the hell was up with Kay? What was the deal with the painting? I don't know. And at this point, 2 years later, I don't care. Story 20. When I was about 7 or 8 years old, my family rented a house near the beach for a week. The drive wasn't very long, but by the time we got there, I really had to feed the porcelain stallion a brown bone. We pulled into the driveway and were greeted by a middle-aged woman who owned the place. She showed us around, talked about the town, and gave us a few suggestions on what to do. My first priority, of course, was finding the bathroom. I asked her, and she told me it was the second door on the right after the kitchen. I went inside, opened the bathroom door, and there was an older man just standing there, staring right at me. I quickly ducked my head, mumbled sorry, and went back outside. Everyone noticed I was back a little too quickly, and I told them someone was already in the bathroom. The woman looked completely confused and said there shouldn't be anyone else in the house. I insisted I'd definitely seen someone in there. After searching the place top to bottom, we found no sign that anyone else had been inside. After a while, the woman admitted that her father used to own the house and had recently passed away. She'd inherited it and wasn't sure what to do with it, so she'd started renting it out. Pretty sure I saw that dude. Story 21. Growing up, my bedroom was the only one that faced the front of the house and the street. When I was about 8 or 9 years old, I woke up to my dad, calmly but firmly, telling me to get up, go into the bathroom, and shut the door. I was annoyed because I was half asleep, but I listened. Apparently, I was more tired than I realized, because I fell asleep on the bathroom floor. The next morning, I asked my mom what had happened. She seemed oblivious and confused. I looked at my dad like she was crazy and asked him why he had woken me up. He denied doing it. I was frustrated to the point of tears, but eventually I let it go. Fast forward to college. I was home for a break when I decided to ask about that night again. I had thought about it off and on for years, and it still bothered me. This time, my dad laughed and said, I was wondering if you even remembered that. It turned out that many houses on our block had been vandalized and robbed back then. Someone had broken into our garage and was inside the house. My room was partially over the garage. My dad had heard the noise and quietly got me to safety. The police were called, and the intruder ran off. He was never caught though, and my parents hadn't wanted to scare me, so for years they pretended nothing had happened. It wasn't anything supernatural, but it was definitely unsettling. Story 22. When I was 16, in the mid-90s, the I know everything, I'm invincible, and you can't stop me age, I got into a fight with an acquaintance while a bunch of us were hanging out at his house. It was a stupid argument. I can't even remember what it was about. Eventually I said, forget it, I'm going home. I lived about 5 miles away, but I didn't have a car, and since it was 2 in the morning, there were no buses running. So I decided to walk home. In the middle of the night, through a neighborhood that wasn't nearly as safe as it seemed, as a tiny 16-year-old girl. So I did. Looking back, I think my friends either didn't believe I was actually going to leave, or were too shocked by the sudden argument to stop me. I walked out and started making my way home. About a mile in, the quiet suburban streets gave way to a main road with highway access. That's when I noticed a grayish minivan. It was following me, passing by, turning a corner, then reappearing a few blocks ahead, over and over. It was painfully obvious what was happening. I crossed to the opposite side of the street so I'd be walking against traffic, making it harder for a car to approach from behind. The van mirrored me, keeping pace on the other side. About another mile down, I spotted a 24-hour Fred Meyer, a West Coast grocery and general store, its lights blazing in the otherwise empty night. The parking lot was mostly deserted, but I didn't hesitate. I crossed the lot quickly and headed straight inside. Just before I reached the doors, the gray minivan that had been following me pulled into one of the parking spots. My heart was pounding. I was ready to bolt inside, but then the driver rolled down his window and called out, "Don't walk over here. Just stay where you are and listen." I just wanted to explain what I was doing. "I saw you walking a while back, but I also noticed a dark car following you. A few times when you turned around or stopped, it turned off onto a side street and then came back again. When I saw that, I started following you both, just to make sure you were safe. Go inside the store and call someone to come pick you up, please. I haven't seen the car since you crossed the parking lot." He waited until he saw me go inside the store, then pulled away. I didn't really have anyone I could call, so I told the night cashier what had happened, and stayed with her for about an hour and a half. When things felt calmer, I finished the walk home. I've never forgotten that night, or that man, whoever he was. I never saw the dark car he mentioned, but I've always believed he saved my life. Story 23. Not to me, but to my sister. She and her husband had just welcomed their first child a few months earlier. My brother-in-law was working the graveyard shift, and my sister was home alone, taking care of my newborn nephew. Around 2 in the morning, she heard loud knocking at the back door. When she went to check, she saw a woman frantically pounding on the glass, begging to be let in. The woman said her husband had just beaten her down the street and was out looking for her. My sister hesitated. She had a newborn in the house and didn't want to risk putting him in danger. She told the woman the best she could do was call the police for her. The woman told my sister not to call the police and begged again to be let inside. That's when my sister's instincts kicked in. something felt off. She stepped away to grab her phone and dialed 911. When she came back to the door, the woman was gone. The police arrived a few minutes later and told my sister that a similar situation had happened just a few streets over. Apparently, it was a setup. The couple would use the same act to trick people into letting them into their homes. I know things like that happen more often than we think, but having it nearly happen to my sister and nephew still creeps me out. Some real Clockwork Orange kind of horror. Story 24. I was home alone once, while my parents were out of town. We had just moved into our new house, and next door was an empty lot with a half-built home. My parents, being a little too trusting, had a habit of leaving the side garage door unlocked. Yeah, I know, not the smartest move. I was watching TV when suddenly the door that leads from the garage into the house started to wiggle. I froze, muted the TV, and listened. A moment later, I saw the handle move again, this time unmistakably. I started freaking out, completely panicked but frozen at the same time. I went to grab the phone, only to realize I couldn't find the house phone anywhere. Then I remembered my cell phone charger was in my parents' car, so the battery was dead. I tore through the house, searching frantically for the landline. Our house was so new that my mom hadn't even put up blinds or curtains in the kitchen or living room yet. That's when it hit me. Whoever was trying the garage door could see straight inside. A second later, the banging started. Loud, deliberate pounding on the living room windows. My stomach dropped. No blinds, no phone, just me and someone staring right into my house. I bolted upstairs, still searching desperately for a phone, my mind racing about how I could get out, whether I'd have to jump from a window if that maniac managed to break in. Then he started pounding on the front door, hard. From the sound of it, I could tell he was using something metal or plastic. Each hit made the door shake, and I was sure he was going to bust it open or even shoot through it. In that moment, panic turned into anger at myself. I was furious for being such a careless teenager who always left the phone lying around after talking on it, never putting it back on the base. I wanted so badly to press the button that made the phone beep so I could find it, but I stopped myself. If he heard it ringing, he'd know exactly where it was and probably smash the nearest window to get in. I suddenly remembered leaving the phone in my mom's room. As I hurried down the hallway toward it, I caught a glimpse out the front window. 2 people were pacing in front of my house. My heart nearly stopped. I tore into my parents' bedroom, frantically searching for my dad's gun while trying not to make any noise. My hands were shaking when I finally found the phone and dialed 911. While I was on the line with the dispatcher, I heard it. A sharp crash as one of the windows shattered downstairs. I froze. The sound stopped just as suddenly as it began. Everything went eerily quiet. I hid in my parents' pitch-black closet, every second dragging on like an eternity. My heart was pounding so hard, I was sure they could hear it. Then finally, faint at first, I heard the distant wail of sirens growing louder. The cops showed up within minutes, but there was no one to be found. I figured whoever it was couldn't have gone far since it had just happened, but they were gone. The police never found the people who tried to get in. On the bright side, the construction company building the house next door, the same one that had built ours, decided to hire overnight security to watch the site and our street until the house was finished. That was a huge relief. It was a terrifying experience. I was 17 at the time, and for about a month afterward, I had night terrors. Eventually, I recovered, but I'll never forget that night. Story 25. This is the story of how a creepy encounter with a strange man at a harbor cafe ended up saving me from something even more terrifying. It happened in the autumn of 1994, when I was 19 years old. At the time, my dad had been working abroad for almost 6 months, and I was planning a surprise visit. My dad and I have always been close. I'm an only child, and my mother passed away from cancer when I was still a baby. So it had always been just the 2 of us, a tiny little family. But he made up for it by being the most amazing parent anyone could ask for. Now that I was grown, I appreciated that more than ever. I had already booked my ticket and was so excited. It was going to be great fun, surprising my dad with a visit. I needed to take the ferry though, and since I had only just gotten my driver's license, I wasn't too thrilled about the idea of driving my little car on board. So I decided to leave it behind and just rent one once I got there. Since I had some time to spare, I stopped by a nearby cafe, for a cup of coffee while waiting for boarding to start. The place was packed with truck drivers, and it didn't take long for me to realize I was the only woman there. One man, around 40, with icy blue eyes and tattoos covering his arms, kept staring at me from across the room. There was something about him that made my skin crawl. I got up to leave, feeling suddenly very uneasy, and to my horror, he followed me. What do I do now? I asked myself. This was before everyone had a cell phone, I should mention. Trying to look busy, I hoped he'd lose interest and go away. I pulled out my ticket and pretended to study it carefully, when he suddenly snatched it right out of my hand. "I'm on the same boat," he said, his voice an unsettling mix of cheerful charm and barely concealed menace. "I'll have hours of your company then. How lovely." I felt a powerful certainty that if I got on that boat with this man who now knew my booking details, I would be in grave danger. I can't explain why the feeling was so overwhelming, but it was, and I decided then and there not to board. The ticket had been inexpensive anyway. I could just catch the next ferry. I hid in the ladies' room until I was sure the boat had departed, then went to rebook my ticket. The story could have ended there, a creepy encounter with a stalkerish man, but it didn't. My instinct had been right. Getting on that ferry would have been unimaginably dangerous. Have you figured it out yet? The date was September 28, 1994. The ship's name was MS Estonia, and that cold night she sank in the Baltic Sea, taking 852 lives with her. The worst ferry disaster to strike Sweden to this day. I still recall that day with horror, and often wonder what might have happened if that unsettling man hadn't taken an interest in me. What if I hadn't listened to my instincts and had boarded the ferry instead of waiting for the next one? Would I have been among the survivors, or would my father have seen my name on the list of lives lost in the Baltic Sea? Story 26. A couple of years ago, I lived in an apartment building that had been converted from a very old hospital into a residential complex, with a few office spaces included. I stayed on the top floor, the 10th floor. I'd had a few strange experiences there, but nothing worth mentioning, at least not until one summer when I went on vacation with my family. Right before we left, I came down with a strange infection that caused me to mostly lose my voice, gave me a headache, and left me with a constant runny nose. No other symptoms, which was odd, but I didn't think much of it. On the last day of the trip, we stopped at a huge antique outlet store, because my parents, in typical old person fashion, love antique shops. There wasn't much that caught my attention, but I ended up buying an old teddy bear for $2 for my girlfriend. It had brown fur with blue underneath, making it look unlike any teddy bear I'd ever seen before. Fast forward to being back home in the apartment. Our place was a fairly large suite, with a massive living room between my room and my roommate's room. He was gone for a few days. When I got back, I was still feeling pretty awful, so I decided to take a nap in the middle of the day. My room had two sections, the main area with my bed, computer, and TV, and through a doorway-sized opening, a smaller space with a sink and a door leading to the bathroom. The sink couldn't be seen from the main room since it was tucked behind a wall. My faucet sometimes dripped if I didn't tighten the handles completely, but this time, as soon as I drifted into that half-asleep state, I suddenly heard the faucet turn on full blast. It was strange, almost impossible, but I got up to check it out and turned off the faucet. As soon as I did, I looked up into the mirror above the sink, and suddenly, my nose just started gushing blood. It wouldn't stop for the longest time. I'd never had a nosebleed in my life until that moment. After I finally managed to stop it, I just wanted to crawl back into bed since I felt even worse. But when I pulled back my blanket, I froze. Tucked neatly under it, right where I sleep, was the pillow that usually sits on the arm of my computer chair to protect my elbow. It's normally wedged in tight, so getting it out takes some effort. There was no way I could have done that myself. Craziness aside, I was still exhausted, and there wasn't much I could do about it, so I put the pillow back and went to sleep. A little while later, I suddenly woke up with the unsettling feeling that I was being watched. When I opened my eyes, my computer chair had been rolled right next to the bed, just 2 feet from my face, and turned to face me, like someone had been sitting there watching me sleep. Normally, that chair stayed across the room and pointed the other way. I was pretty freaked out, so I got up, grabbed a drink, and checked the apartment to make sure no one was there. Still feeling sick and exhausted, I lay back down to nap again. But when I woke up the second time, that same eerie feeling hit me and the chair was back in the same spot. At that point, my dad called a few minutes later, and I figured I should tell him everything, just in case I mysteriously ended up murdered or something. I tend to walk around while talking on the phone, so with the phone in one hand, I opened a bottle of ibuprofen with the other. I clearly remember setting the cap down on my computer desk. Then I walked over to the sink to get some water to take the pills. I was out of sight of the desk for maybe 20 seconds. When I came back, still on the phone, the cap was gone. I told my dad and started looking for it, thinking maybe I'd knocked it off the desk without realizing. But after a few seconds, a thought hit me. I said, "No way." To my dad, pulled back the blanket on my bed, and sure enough, the cap was sitting right there. There was absolutely no way I could have put it there, even by accident. And through all of this, that little teddy bear just sat on the end table in the corner, staring right at me. Nothing else strange happened after that, except for the constant feeling that something was watching me from the darkness near the sink at night while I tried to sleep. That uneasy feeling lasted for about a week, then faded away. A few people later told me that the top floor in many old hospitals was usually the psychiatric ward, but I'm not sure if that was true in this case. Anyway, sorry for the long story, but I wanted to paint the scene so you could experience the creepiness right along with me. Story 27. I have 4 kids aged 8, 6, 2, and 1. My oldest son has always had strange things happen around him. Typical poltergeist stuff. When he was a baby, I once heard his dresser drawer open and close through the baby monitor. It was just the 2 of us home at the time, and I had put him to bed about 2 hours earlier. He could climb out of his crib by then, but the drawers had child-proof slides. You had to lift them up before pulling, so there was no way he could open them on his own. When I went into his room, he was sound asleep. The drawers were closed, but a new outfit was sitting neatly folded on the changing table. It definitely freaked me out, but I managed to brush it off. Nothing happened for a while after that, and we eventually moved into a townhouse when we were expecting our second child, his little sister. Flash forward to the week after my daughter was born. I bought her a tall 6-drawer dresser, but the base was a little too narrow to be completely stable. To be safe, I picked up a couple of 90-degree brackets and screwed the dresser to the wall, just in case my little spider monkey son decided to climb it. 6 months went by without any issues. One evening, my wife went out with her friends for dinner and a movie. She was supposed to come home after dinner to breastfeed the baby, then head back out. I called to let her know that the baby had already fallen asleep and had taken a bottle like a champ, so there was no need to rush home. I was playing Halo, just finished a match, and decided to step outside for a smoke and grab a beer. I had just lit my cigarette when I heard a horrible crash from inside. I ran back in to find my daughter's dresser tipped over against her crib, the top drawer hanging open and stopping just inches from her face, still barely attached to the frame. Really confused, I lifted the dresser back into place and checked on my son. He wasn't in his crib. He'd somehow snuck out and was fast asleep in my bed. Strange, but I brushed it off. The next morning, I told my wife what had happened. She pointed out something even weirder. She reminded me that I had screwed the dresser to the wall. Then she told me that earlier that week, she'd found 2 3-inch screws in our son's crib. We never figured that one out. Now here's the strangest part. It was my 4th child's first birthday. We were still living in the same place, and by then, my oldest son had turned out just like me. Smart and handsome. It was almost midnight, and I was heading upstairs to bed when my wife asked me to come out for a smoke first. I turned back, made a mental note that all the kids' doors were closed, and followed her outside. I was outside for maybe 2 minutes when my neighbor walked by. We chatted for a bit, and then he suddenly looked up and asked why my son's light was on. I looked up too, and sure enough, his bedroom light was on, along with the bathroom light. Odd, since the light fixture was on the ceiling fan, and at 8 years old, he was way too short to reach it. Exactly like me at that age. I ran upstairs to check and found 3 open bedroom doors, but no lights on, and all the kids were sound asleep. I went back downstairs and told my wife there were no lights on, but when I looked out the window again, they were still shining bright. This time, my neighbor came in with me, while my wife had 911 already dialed, her finger hovering over the send button. We went upstairs together. The doors were all closed again. We opened each one by one, no lights on anywhere. After quietly checking every room and closet for an intruder, we went back downstairs to tell my wife the house was clear. My neighbor, who's usually a very rational guy, was visibly shaken. From outside, the lights were still on, but from inside, they were off. My wife swore they'd never gone out. That was enough for him to head home and grab his hunting guns, because, well, Canada and firearm storage laws. By that point, my wife had already called the police, and they said they were about 4 minutes away. My neighbor came back with his over-under and handed me a 12 gauge for good measure. I'm not usually the take-a-gun type, but I accepted it nonetheless. As I re-entered the house, my TV turned off, the microwave beeped, and a door slammed somewhere. I bolted upstairs, straight into the baby's room. He was awake, eyes darting around nervously. Even at just a year old, I could see the fear in his little face. I scooped him up immediately as my bedroom door creaked open and slammed shut. I screamed at the top of my lungs, in my most protective dad voice. I don't know what or who you are, but if you ever try to hurt my kids again, I guarantee the hell you're living in is nothing compared to the pain I'll put you through. Get the hell away from my children. Just then, the police came running upstairs as the baby monitor started crackling with static. I woke up my oldest, and the officers grabbed my other 2 kids as we all rushed downstairs. They cleared the house, scolded my neighbor and me for having loaded guns, and reminded me that I wasn't certified to even handle one. Everything seemed to calm down, and as we stood outside catching our breath, the bedroom light suddenly turned off on its own. The police ran back inside, but of course found nothing. We spent the night at my sister-in-law's house. The next day, I reached out to a native friend, who arranged for a woman from his band to come smudge the house. Another friend told me that a spirit might have attached itself to my oldest son. I don't know if I believe all that supernatural stuff, but ever since then, nothing strange has happened. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.